Hi, this is Jonathan Armstrong from Punter Southall Law, and I'm pleased to start again our head-to-head series. And this is part two, if you like, of my discussion with Richard Bistrong. I'm so glad that you could come over to London to join us. And we just held the thought at the end of part one on looking at some of the latest research about ethics and compliance and how people behave. And I sort of interrupted you in the middle of a train of thought on culture and how people cope with the varying pressures of the corporate environment. So why don't we pick that up there?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. And I was sharing before that I have had the honor of working with the LRN team for the past year and a half. So I'm dating ourselves. We're in 2024 now.
Yeah.
And they have published some really interesting data. So every year they publish data on program effectiveness. And in their 2024 data, and I think this is the 10th year of this survey, and maybe we can put a link to it if anyone wants to deep dive, they talked about how high-performing programs are now using values over rules in their program effectiveness. So that I think that speaks to the importance of people understanding the why of compliance, right? Why these policies, rules, and procedures are there to protect you and the organization, but to keep you as the guardian and gatekeeper of our values, of our integrity, of our code. So I think it's a very important and meaningful shift towards a values-based approach to ethics and compliance initiatives, to even codes of conduct now that I read are much more values-based, because especially in some highly regulated industries, you can't have a rule for everything. And I don't know that that would be a fun company to work for or work with, right?
I mean, that's fascinating, isn't it? Because I've studied some of the Victorian entrepreneurs in the UK, and for many of them, maybe Andrew Carnegie's the exception, for many of them, what they concentrated on was ethics and values. And so if you look at people like, Lever Brothers, if you look at Cadbury, if you look at Terry's, so some really large Victorian corporations, they found values first. And interestingly, I don't make a wider point than this, there's oftentimes a connection between their religious persuasion as well. So some of these organizations are from a Quaker background, for example, where they'll try and instill their version of Quaker values throughout the organization. And so as a result, I guess, things like written policies and written procedures are less important because you've got that values buy-in. And so maybe this is just a very old idea that's coming back into society. Is that crazy, or is that?
Well, I appreciate the history on that, because that's worth taking a look at, that this isn't something that's necessarily new, that if we look back in Victorian times, that companies that didn't have the ability to roll out a code of conduct, how were they going to inspire ethical decision making, right? So what an interesting way that maybe we've gone full circle in terms of returning to that values-based approach.
Yeah, I was struck by in the latest LRN report, there's a quote from, I guess, a mutual friend of ours, Mike Volkov, who says, "Culture is the company's most effective control." So if you've got the culture right and the values right, as you're discussing, then hopefully people will make decisions that reflect that culture. Does that chime with the work you've done?
It does. And I think that, culture, we have to break that down, right? Because what does that mean? And my definition will just be one of many, and especially in some of the LRN reports, they talk about things like psychological safety. Do we have not only a speak-up environment, but do we have a listen up environment? Right? Because it's one thing to say, oh, we have a whistleblower hotline, or, oh, my door is always open. Well, Jonathan, that puts all the pressure on the individual, right? If I've seen workplace misconduct, oh, the door is open, there's a whistleblower hotline, that, as Amy Edmondson talks about in her work, there's another book called Speak Up by Megan Reitz. Everything about our DNA goes against speaking up. It's called instinctual and inherent fear of speaking up. And as the LRN benchmark of ethical culture 2024 report demonstrates, is most people don't speak up because they don't think anything's going to happen.
Yeah.
Futility. Or worse, they think it's going to be mismanaged. So the question is, what can we do to be better listeners? What do we do to inspire a culture where we know that if we come to someone in person, our manager, that it's going to be a productive conversation, it's going to be an open conversation, a non-judgmental conversation. And there's some great books that have tools on to demonstrate how we are and how we can be good listeners.
Yes.
Take some of that pressure off.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? Because I think a lot of the work I've done with whistleblowers and whistleblower helplines, etc., is not only is there a cultural piece, there's almost a genetic piece as well. Certainly in Europe, you can work out with Wikipedia almost those parts of Europe that are going to have a cultural sensitivity whenever it comes to speaking up. And as you say, there's an inherent reluctance to speak up for many people, and that can be reinforced by inherited values. If they come from former Soviet states,
right,
where there's been a history of repression, from Italy, from Spain, from Germany, from France, then there's that. Even whistleblower helplines in France have been called by public officials, instruments of anonymous denunciation.
Oh,
and
how
so,
awful sounding.
Yeah. So you're right that there are, there's a number of hurdles to jump, and I guess for most corporations, there are two things, aren't there? First of all, you have got to welcome criticism. You've got to welcome whether or not people are right. So you've got to say thank you for every report you get, even if it makes your own day a terrible day if you're a chief compliance officer. But the other thing that interested me in the LRN research is that there is a reward in that approach, in that I think the report says that the companies with the strongest ethical culture outperform others by 50%, which is a big margin, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's not just financial, that's in workplace satisfaction. And a big sunken cost is reduction of turnover in your workforce. So think about the side effects. It's just not, oh, here's how we perform on the stock market. It's we have a happier workforce, we have bigger workforce retention. So all of those are positive effects of having that listen up environment. And one of the things that I've seen clients do, Jonathan, and I think this is such a powerful tool, is they will take, and they'll anonymize it, a whistleblower report or an incident that got escalated and it actually resulted in a reduction in business. In other words, someone did the right thing and it had a negative financial impact, right? Maybe it was not taking an order or a supply chain disruption, which ended up costing the company business, and they will celebrate that.
Yes.
And say, someone did the right thing and we lost money and we are so proud of this individual. So think about the signal that it sends. It sends that, number one, if you do speak up, we do listen. And number two, even if it costs the business, we celebrate that success.
Yes.
It's not a financial failure, it's a speak up success.
Yeah, that is very powerful. I can think back to something that we did not so long ago with a client who was thinking of getting an arrangement together with a business partner who was going to resell product for them. And the in this case, the head of legal had some, as she put it, some lingering doubts about the partner, but nothing she could put a finger on, and asked me to get involved as outside counsel and chat with this partner. So we had a sort of Teams call together, and I asked them a number of questions about compliance stance and didn't receive great answers, to be honest. And they then they hung up, and we continued, our team, if you like. And I said, okay, what are the next steps? What are we doing next? And she just said, we're telling them politely that the deal is off. And I was thinking, having done, been down this road for 30 years, that they were going to somehow paper over the cracks that appeared. But she was very, very adamant. And the thing that I particularly liked is the business lead also said, that's the right decision. Yeah. And then to your point, because they were very far down the road with this potential partner, they then communicated all of this internally. Wow. We know we had high hopes for this deal. We knew it might increase revenue by X. We didn't doubt any of that, but we couldn't get an alignment with our values. And you're exactly right. That sent the whole message through the company that the only way to do business is the right way, if you like.
That's so powerful, Jonathan, and it also helps to mitigate one of the stronger biases out there, which is escalation of commitment, or the rabbit hole effect. Is once we're way into a transaction and sort of closer to the finish line, sometimes we'll take more risk to get there as we get closer. So the fact that an organization already took those steps toward that business and then stopped it at a certain point is very, very powerful. And the fact that people knew about it and they didn't keep it a secret is even better. But I'll give you one counterintuitive piece of the LRN research.
Yeah.
And like to hear what you think about this. So it is quite counterintuitive. In the Benchmark of Ethical Culture 2024 report, it talked about, and this is like 8,500 employees across 13 industries in 15 countries, is they talk about Gen Z, which I think is in the 23 to 28-year-old. I know that I'm not one of them, but it's the younger generation, Gen Z, and they have a higher tolerance for misconduct. So I'm reading this from the statistics. They are 2.5 times more likely to agree that it's okay to break the rules to get the job done than boomers are.
Yeah.
And a quarter of them report that they have personally engaged in unethical conduct. So I think we tend to think of Gen Z as more socially conscious, more ESG aware. So how do you square up this data with that perception?
Yeah, I didn't know you were going to highlight that. And that was actually on my list. And I'm going to be very, very careful of what I say here, because I think one of my daughters is Gen Z as we would say, and one isn't. And I don't want anybody attributing what I'm going to say to either of those. But I thought that whole thing was intriguing, and on my limited non-statistical sample, what I wondered if actually was going on there was honesty. Mm-hmm. My perception is that Gen Z tend to be more honest and upfront about what's happening, and I just wonder if, for example, my generation would be ashamed to say they'd broken the rules. But I just wonder if it's a factor of more self-analysis and self-confession rather than the empirical data being different. And I guess that's maybe one of the things that it'd be really interesting to see if the survey was done again next year. Is the Armstrong hunch crazy, or is it with them being more self-aware? But I found that fascinating. And in any event, whatever the answer is, that's disturbing, isn't it? That 25% of the future of our organisations has already broken the rule. And these are people who've only been in the work environment for 5, 6, 7 years. And they've already, 25% of them, 1 in 4, has already broken the rules that we've set down. I mean, that is something that we really do need to address, whether or not that's them being more open, or whether or not that's a problem that's magnifying.
Well, I suggest that you go ahead and copyright the Armstrong hunch after we're done here, before I do, because that's a great term. But, that's interesting. I haven't thought about the actual methodology. It's sort of like if your whistleblowing hotline reports are going up, does that mean that misconduct is going up, or does it mean that more people are comfortable using your whistleblower hotline?
Yes, yeah.
So I think that's a good challenge to the methodology, but time will tell. And one of the things, as we've parsed out this issue with compliance peers, is there might be greater awareness from Gen Z that I'll do no harm. So if I'm going to make a bad decision that is going to have a bad impact on a community or people, that's not something I'm going to engage in. However, I have all these tasks I need to do. I don't have long deadlines. So if I need to take a shortcut to circumvent rules to get my job done, that's okay. So again, it goes back to maybe from a training perspective, because I think there are training implications to that data. Maybe younger people need to appreciate, what, even a shortcut is not victimless. Right?
Yes.
And as Amy Edmondson, the nice thing about a shortcut is it helps the person that takes it, but it puts the entire organization at risk. Yeah. So maybe that's a training and awareness part. And the other thing that we've been talking about is maybe with Gen Z, the loyalty to an organization might be a little different than it was a generation before, to where if I need to take a shortcut to get this job done, I'm going to do it. So
I think that's a great point. And bear in mind the fact that probably half of that generation that's in the workforce now were dropped in it during the pandemic. They were recruited then. They were working from home before they were working in the office. And I think if I look back at the start of my career, a lot of your office or work environment related behavior, you sort of got by osmosis. You sort of got by being in the office, and you knew the standards of dress and you knew the standards of behavior. But that wasn't because somebody sat you down and told you that. You gathered that from being in that office environment. And 50% of that subset have been denied that opportunity, haven't they? Their normal to start with was sitting in the spare bedroom or sharing a flat share and dividing the table into 3 or whatever that might be. And that isn't normal. And so I think in some respects we've got to be forgiving of that generation because they didn't have a normal start to the work environment. But I think part of the answer to that, having been involved in helping clients look at programs that capture this generation, one of the things that I've found works is you've got to involve representatives and statistically sound representatives of that group in the process as well. So whenever you're setting up particularly things like social media policies, particularly things like BYOD policies, you've got to involve that generation in setting the process. Because if you're, pale, male, and stale, and you're writing the policy for everybody else, you're bound to fail. Whereas if you've got a representative group who are designing the policies, you've at least got a chance of people buying in. Does that resonate?
It absolutely resonates. And with LRN, we've been running masterclass and sort of open table discussions. And a lot of the discussion around this issue has been from a learning, education, and training perspective. We need to get that generation involved, not just as the recipient of training, but we need their input so that they understand what's going on, that they have that buy-in. So I think that's spot on, Jonathan, is getting them more involved in the process. Novartis published, it was on LinkedIn, about how they crowdsourced their code of conduct.
Yeah.
Right, and really got input from the field before just rolling something down. So I think that's a great way to mitigate, if it's not a statistical anomaly, it's a great way to mitigate that mentality as well. Why don't you help us in the creation, and you'll understand why we have these rules.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
That sounds really good. Now, I'm conscious that we're running short on time, but one thing I wanted to sort of almost finish on is you said something really, really interesting as we were getting ready for this about consolidation, mergers and acquisitions. And we're undoubtedly in a sort of, if we were a airline flight, we're entering the turbulence. We can see that there's going to be a lot of consolidation. A lot of companies are struggling to raise money. They're struggling to recruit. And we are, I think, in a buckle the seatbelt time. Yeah. And you talked as we were getting ready about how that impacts culture in an organization and more of a what's in it for me. We certainly see it in terms, even in data security terms, where you'll see more stuff exiting the organization if you've got good data loss prevention software. People are moving address books, they're moving contact books because they think they won't be in work. But how does that translate into the wider compliance environment?
Yeah, that it's such an important issue because I call them career-changing moments, right? Where we think, okay, there's downsizing or rapid change in my company or in this industry, and we start thinking, am I next? What's going to happen with me? So we think about three things: me, and me. So during times of stress, anxiety, and uncertainty, we might see people wanting to prove their value to the company so they are feeling more confident that they're not next, right? To show that they're a great performer, and they might be willing to take shortcuts, even with good intentions, to get there. And there's some good research on this. So I think if you acknowledge the elephant in the room, if you're in a market that's facing headwinds, disruption, whether it's supply chain disruption or market disruption or internal disruption or transformation, acknowledge that this stress and uncertainty and anxiety exists, and to be proactive about it. Amy Edmondson in the Fearless Organization says, it doesn't always have to be a huge webinar or fancy Zoom meeting. It could just be a call and to say, look, how are you managing? I know it's a difficult time out there. We just want you to know, even with everything that's going on, you're never alone when facing a difficult ethical decision. So we're just doing a check-in to make sure that everything's okay. Now, that's not a one and done exercise. It's like, okay, I called person X, now person Y. That needs to be revisited so that when people do face that stress and that anxiety, they know that, look, even with this turbulence, my company's still there for me. So it's not a time to dial down ethics and compliance from, I think, a behavioral and a humanistic approach. It's a time to dial up those touch points with the workforce.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, isn't it? And I know Tom Fox, I think, had this great phrase about the difficulty with compliance is we often seek the results in the rearview mirror. So we don't know that our compliance program is failing today. We find out in 3 years' time when there's the FCPA investigation, or when there's the litigation, or when there's the class actions or whatever. So it's important, isn't it, to think about what's happening now and be able to address it. So to look at your culture and look at what's happening in your organization, even with the storms all around.
Exactly. Look at your psychological safety. Look at your middle level management. Do the survey and see, does the front line feel the same way as the C-suite does about ethics and compliance and culture? Even if it's a mini pulse, like get a read for the organization so that you're not having to say, well, we had a compliance failure and now it's too late for everyone.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's so many proactive measures and tools out there, even that we didn't have when we last had this discussion. And I think we were figuring it out 2017 or circa 2017.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. One thing I've learned is that we need to do this more regularly than every 6 or 7 years.
For sure.
I think time's got the better of us now. So we'll probably say goodbye to the audience. Thanks very much for listening or watching our chat. And hopefully we can sit down and discuss this survey in a year's time, if not before, Richard.
I'm looking forward to it, and we're going to find out about the Armstrong hutch in a year from now.
That would be good.
Super. Thanks, Jonathan.
And thanks for watching.
Thanks, everybody.